Erica Adams is clerk of the Peace and Social Order Committee, and she's the hostess for this meeting today.
Welcome to Second Sunday Forum. Today is September 11th, 2022. We are hosted by the West Falmouth Preparative Meeting and the Quaker meeting committee that's called Peace and Social Order. And we acknowledge that we're on Wampanoag land. Today, our topic is reflecting on Quaker work at the United Nations, applying lessons from the life and the wisdom of Bayard Rustin. Our speaker today is Sarah Clark. She's the director since 2019 in the New York office of the Quaker United Nations office, CUNO. And she was a rep at CUNO from 2002 to 2014. Originally from Ottawa Monthly Meeting in Canada, she now lives in Philadelphia with her family. The topic is, as we approach the 75th anniversary of Quaker work at the United Nations, we have an opportunity to reflect on the valuable lessons about the Quaker traditions of nonviolence and direct engagement. The life and wisdom of Quaker civil rights activist Bayard Rustin offers insights and lessons that continue to guide us today and as we look into the future. Sarah not only serves in the Quaker United Nations office in New York, she leads the CUNO's engagement with the United Nations, diplomats and civil society representatives, bringing Quaker practice and insights into the work of the UN system. She holds a master's in international political economy from London School of Economics and has worked in the field of peace building and conflict transformation for over 20 years. Previously, she served in CUNO from 2002 to 4, undertaking a variety of peace building actors in Myanmar, including the UN. In her work, she brings a passion for building inclusive dialogue between stakeholders and strengthening engagement between non-state actors and international policymakers. Sarah is originally from Canada, as I said, and works in New York and resides in Philadelphia. The second Sunday will be followed by a question-answer session. You may put your questions in chat. This is not available to people who are on YouTube. They cannot ask questions, and it is filmed and edited and posted with permission of the speaker on Facebook, rather slowly because we're a small group. So with that, I would also like to add, please, this is recorded and don't post your emails and chat, and don't give away things like that in public speaking. Okay, please, Sarah, continue. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Erica, and good afternoon, friends. Kind of gray and rainy greetings from Philadelphia. It's wonderful to have a chance to be together today. And I think, as Erica has already outlined, my name is Sarah Clark, and I am a member of Ottawa Monthly Meeting. I use she, her pronouns. And I grew up in Ottawa Meeting, which sits on the unceded lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I lived in Canada until I was in my early 20s. And since then, I have lived most of my adult life in Southeast Asia, particularly Myanmar or Burma, Thailand and Cambodia, but also in the United States, including 14 years in New York City. And yes, I currently live in Philadelphia with my family. Some of you may know that tomorrow evening, I am giving the annual Stephen G. Carey Lecture at Pendle Hill. The event will be live streamed, and you can register to watch that event by going to the Pendle Hill website. The presentation I will share with you today will be a dress rehearsal of the lecture I will give tomorrow. I am really grateful to have the chance to share with you all today and really welcome feedback on the presentation that I have prepared. So it was November 2021, less than a year ago, when I was appointed as the director of the Quaker United Nations office in New York. The months since then have been a wonderful homecoming, as I did previously serve as one of the Quaker representatives from 2002 until 2014. Having worked in the past for the American Friends Service Committee, I was familiar with Stephen Carey's name, but I was really glad to receive the book about Stephen's life as I set about preparing for the lecture that I'll give tomorrow. There is this wonderful memoir, and if you haven't read it, it really provides a wonderful view into a fascinating life and the achievements of a man who undoubtedly really let his life speak for himself. If you have read the book, you will know that Bayard Rustin makes a cameo appearance. While we celebrate the life and accomplishments of Stephen Carey, our Quaker community has done less to hold up and celebrate the lives of those in our community who are people of color. This is manifest in a number of different ways. For one thing, Quakers have been slow to engage in frank conversations about the roles that members of our community played around slavery in this country. While we are quick to point to friends who are remembered for their role in abolition, we are less willing to reflect on the painfully slow process that was needed for the Religious Society of Friends to come together in unity in opposition to slavery. In order to be a community that offers a sense of belonging to all, including friends of African descent, we need to be open to undertake this difficult conversation. Today, here in North America, also, we are often oblivious to the fact that the largest community of Quakers in the world actually lives in Africa. Friends World Committee for Consultation estimates Kenya yearly meeting to have approximately 120,000 members. This is far larger than the number of Quakers in membership in the US, which is estimated to be around 76,000. It is 10 times the number of Quakers in membership in the UK. The Quaker community in Kenya comprises individuals who have served as leaders in parliament and have been posted as ambassadors. But here in North America, most of us are oblivious to the accomplishments of our Kenyan brothers and sisters. I have worked with Quaker service agencies since the late 1990s, and am deeply grateful today in 2022 that I can look around and see leaders and mentors who are people of color. These include my counterpart, Nazizwe Madlala Rutledge, who serves as the director of the Quaker UN office in Geneva, as well as Joyce Ajluni, who serves as general secretary at the American Friends Service Committee. That said, as a faith community with members in all parts of the globe, we have much work to do in order to hold up and celebrate the members of our community, past and present, who are people of color. This thought was in the back of my mind as I read Stephen Carey's memoir. And from what I know about Steve, I think he would have agreed with me. In fact, I credit Steve's story about Bayard Rustin as a message that set me on a track for today's discussion. I want to acknowledge my own positionality in undertaking this project and that I have come to it as someone who lives with tremendous privilege. I am a straight, economically secure woman of European descent who has had access to higher education and the ability to travel and connect with people around the world. The career I've had and the life I have led have been facilitated by the privilege that I was born into. Also, I want to acknowledge that there are other important efforts being made within the Religious Society of Friends to celebrate the lives of Quakers of color. One initiative is the Black Quaker Project, created by friend Hal Weaver. I encourage friends to seek out and take advantage of such resources as we all work to lift up the diversity within our community. Shining a light on these stories is not a task solely for people of color. White people, white Quakers, also share in the responsibility to honor and celebrate the diverse leaders in our community. Finally, I want to emphasize that I am certainly no expert in the life of Bayard Rustin. This will not be a presentation that tells you everything you ever wanted to know about this important American leader. However, there are many wonderful books, documentaries, and podcasts, and I urge you all to explore these. So today, what I want to do is hold up the linkages and commonalities between Bayard Rustin's work and the work that we do at the Quaker UN office. At the same time, it's important to note that there are differences between the approach that Bayard Rustin took and our work at the UN. Friend Bayard used and developed the tools of direct action and mass mobilization. In fact, the achievements for which he is probably best known include his support for Dr. Martin Luther King during the Montgomery bus boycott and as the architect of the 1963 March on Washington. This is not the type of work that our office does at the UN. In learning about Bayard's life, there are wonderful stories of instances where he led marches in front of the UN buildings in New York. So while Bayard's life and work focused on engaging and mobilizing people outside the UN, our work is focused on engagement inside the UN buildings. That said, many important linkages exist. And to highlight those commonalities, let's pause and think about the world into which both Bayard and the UN were born. Bayard Rustin was born on March 17th, 1912 in Westchester, Pennsylvania, not far from where I am today. He was raised by his Quaker grandmother and graduated high school and then went on to undertake several years of college during the early 1930s. At the same time, in Europe, the League of Nations, which had been formed after the First World War, was struggling to preserve peace and security in Europe. Punishments meted out by the Treaty of Versailles, combined with the impact of a worldwide economic depression, saw the emergence of fascism and instability in Central Europe. As a peace church with a long history and commitment to nonviolence, Quakers took a deep interest in the League of Nations. Quakers were posted in Geneva to represent the Religious Society of Friends at the League of Nations, as that earlier experiment in multilateralism struggled to make it through the 1920s and the 1930s. While the situation in Europe deteriorated, Bayard Rustin came to live in Harlem and New York City. This was also a time when Bayard became connected with peace organizations such as the American Friends Service Committee and the Fellowship of Reconciliation. So while the world hurtled towards another world war, Bayard immersed himself in pacifism and nonviolence. As a result of his commitment, he would spend 3 years in prison as a conscientious objector from 1944 until 1946. United Nations was formed in 1947, a year after Bayard's release from prison. Emerging in the wake of terrible devastation caused by the Second World War, countries came together to form an international body with the aim of preventing future global catastrophes. Also in 1947, Quakers applied for accreditation at the UN and began working at the UN in New York the following year. There are Quaker offices in both New York and Geneva. Both offices represent the worldwide community of Quakers on behalf of Friends World Committee for Consultation, or FWCC. In addition to our relationship with FWCC, the American Friends Service Committee, or AFSC, serves as the other parent organization for our office in New York. Priorities for our work at the UN are set by a committee that is made up of representatives appointed jointly by AFSC and FWCC. And here, I want to give a shout out to our committee member, Carolyn Jordan, who is with us today. And I know that I can speak on behalf of all of our staff about how grateful we are that Carolyn is part of that committee and works closely with us in thinking about what we do and the way that we represent Quakers at the UN. In New York, we work in close partnership with UN diplomats and officials to increase the global commitment to the UN's role as a promoter of lasting peace We believe that the UN will only fulfill this aspect of its mandate when its peace initiatives truly respond to community needs, and we seek to build bridges between the UN and in New York and voices and perspectives on the ground. Whether in New York or Geneva, Quakers working at the UN have long believed that providing quiet spaces away from formal UN meeting rooms will allow important and constructive conversations to take place. In our work, we use Quaker House as a setting where we bring a diversity of concerns, views, and perspectives before UN decision makers. This allows UN officials and diplomats to receive information they might not otherwise be able to access and to work together to forge new and creative solutions. To learn more about QUNO, I encourage you all to visit our website, which is quno.org. And in particular, I encourage you all to sign up and receive our regular newsletters, which will keep you up to date on the work that is being carried out in both New York and Geneva. As I've mentioned, the approach of our work, which tends to be quiet inside the halls of the UN, really does stand in contrast to the type of work that is most often associated with Bayard Rustin. Friend Bayard advocated for people to practice social dislocation and to use nonviolent disobedience to challenge authority. It is, however, in the commitment to nonviolence and pacifism where our work at the UN connects with the life of Bayard Rustin. From the 1940s onwards, Bayard studied the philosophy of nonviolence and played a pivotal role bringing these methods to the United States. While Dr. King is widely seen as a leader who integrated nonviolence into the civil rights movement, it was Bayard Rustin who pushed Dr. King to fully embrace this approach. Likewise, in our work at the UN in New York, our ultimate aim is to consistently push and challenge international policymakers to find nonviolent solutions, recognizing, as Dr. King said, that violence begets violence. We must meet the forces of hate with the power of love. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. To give a little more of a flavor of our work in New York, I want to share a story from my own experience having worked at QUNO in the past. The meeting I am thinking of really stands out on my mind because today marks the 21st anniversary of the September 11th attacks. We grieve the loss of life that occurred on that day, and we also grieve the disastrous policies and actions that were then set in motion by the US government and others, and that produced many, many thousands of deaths in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. In the period after September 11th, the US responded with fear and retribution, launching a war on terror and insisting that we do not engage with terrorists. In the wake of these events, the question of how and whether to engage with armed groups became a very sensitive one at the UN. During this period, QUNO hosted a small briefing at Quaker House on the topic of engagement with armed groups. For QUNO, this theme has been an important one as it connects with and is informed by our Quaker belief that there is that of God or the divine in everyone. This has shaped our interest and support for mediation efforts and the idea that peace is best brought about by dialogue and seeking mutual understanding, not isolation and punishment. For the meeting, we brought together two experts with a small group of UN diplomats. The experts had been involved in peace talks in Northern Ireland and a peace process that had taken place in Lebanon. The meeting provided a space for our guests to share their insights and lessons learned with diplomats from a variety of countries in Southeast Asia. We started the meeting by emphasizing that our guests had come to a safe space where they could speak openly and share frank exchange of ideas. The meeting was small, which allowed diplomats to engage actively and ask our visiting experts some really challenging questions. For instance, how to build connections with moderate leaders, how to support armed actors to transform their struggle into political movements or political parties. We also discussed the need to avoid using pejorative language, which prompted one of the diplomats to share their own experience of observing a mediation effort when a government leader stopped referring to the other side as terrorists and instead began calling them my brothers in the jungle. The diplomat noted that this shift had a transformative effect on the ability of the government and the armed group to undertake constructive conversations. While the meeting started out as a formal briefing, over the course of the discussion, the diplomats relaxed and began to talk openly about both the opportunities and the challenges facing their own countries. This discussion spilled well over the scheduled time slot and finally ended as our guests left expressing thanks for the opportunity to openly talk about some really difficult issues. This is just one example from many, and I hope it gives a sense of what our work looks like in action. While Bayard Rustin brought the philosophy of nonviolence into the US civil rights movement in the 1960s, this is one example of how Quakers continue to weave our commitment to nonviolence into engagement with members of the UN community. Another key aspect of Bayard Rustin's strategy for change was his focus on ordinary people. Bayard believed that ordinary people could make a big difference. As friend George Lakey said in a recent article, Bayard always urged organizers to pay close attention when people are in motion. In Quaker work at the UN in New York, we believe that UN officials and diplomats must be informed by the perspectives and wisdom coming from outside the UN world. We face a challenge in this work because the UN is an institution formed by governments, which means that it is often dominated by perspectives of elites. In New York, our role has often been to lift up the voices that otherwise go unheard in this setting. Another important linkage between the approach embraced by Bayard Rustin throughout his life and the approach that underpins Quaker work at the UN is our common focus on internationalism. Internationalism refers to the belief that people should seek out opportunities to cooperate, coordinate, and unite across national boundaries. It can be contrasted to the principle of nationalism, which promotes the interests of a particular country and the importance of building a single, strong national identity. Bayard Rustin first traveled outside the US in 1948, visiting India and connecting with leaders from the nonviolent independence movement there. In the early 1950s, Bayard also traveled to Africa, connecting with prominent individuals from different independence movements in Africa. These trips allowed him to build direct relationships with important leaders in the global South, including Prime Minister Nehru in India, Prime Minister Nkrumah in Nigeria, and President Ezekwe in Ghana. And while Bayard is frequently associated with civil rights efforts focused on racial equality in the US, he was also deeply engaged around international nuclear disarmament. Towards the end of the 1950s, while working with the Committee for Nonviolent Action, he was an active leader in the anti-nuclear movement, leading marches in the UK and Germany. In 1959, he took part in the Sahara Project, a campaign that brought together Bayard's passion around nuclear disarmament and the struggle for freedom and self-determination in Africa. Later in life, Bayard would renew his engagement on international issues, focusing on the spread of democracy and providing provision of humanitarian assistance, In particular, he carried out an important advocacy on behalf of refugees fleeing the upheavals in Vietnam and Cambodia. Likewise, the mandate of both Quaker UN offices embraces this same commitment to internationalism. In Geneva, Quaker representatives focus on issues related to peace and disarmament, the human rights of migrants, sustainable and just economics, and the human impacts of climate change. In New York, where we focus on expanding the number of diplomats and UN officials who are committed to peaceful solutions, we engage around the vital issue of youth inclusion in peacebuilding, the question of how peacebuilding can inform responses to crisis. And we work with UN counterparts as they take up the recent proposal of the UN Secretary General to launch a new agenda for peace. Underpinning all of this work is a belief shared with friend Bayard in the importance of connecting and supporting those from around the world without fear of labeling others as outsiders. Indeed, from what I know of Bayard Rustin's life, I am able to see many instances when he embraced that invitation of George Fox, as we do today, to walk cheerfully over the earth, answering that of God in everyone. I want to conclude this reflection by holding up one other significant lesson that we can learn from the life of Bayard Rustin, and that is the importance of embracing diversity and building communities in which everyone shares a sense of belonging. As many of you will know, Bayard Rustin was an openly gay man during a period when the rights of the LGBTQ community were severely restricted in the United States. Despite his brilliance as an organizer and a strategist, friend Bayard found himself repeatedly pushed to the margins. His pragmatic approach led him to carefully weigh any potential damage that his personal life could bring to the movement, leading him to play a pivotal role, but usually from the background. Also, there were a number of moments when the organizations and movements with which he worked painfully discarded or distanced themselves from him. These breaks would emerge out of a fear of Bayard Rustin's association with the Communist Party early on in his career, his reputation as a conscientious objector, and his sexual identity. Painful breaks also emerged in the second half of the 1960s as issues related to economic justice took greater prominence in his work. Bayard's essay, From Protest to Politics, captured the priorities that he saw around building coalitions and working with moderates. But this pragmatic direction in his work provoked condemnation by some on the radical left. What was surely a painful experience for Bayard was also a loss for the communities and movements with which he worked. There is no denying that Bayard Rustin was a master of strategy and tactics, but when movements for social change turn inward and attack members of our own communities because they do not live up to an imposed litmus test, we lose important gifts. Rather than embracing and learning from the diversity of views and perspectives in our midst, we sometimes punish or push individuals to the margins. Let us learn from the life of Bayard Rustin, not just from his talents and skills that were used, including his focus on nonviolence, his commitment to holding up the voices of ordinary people, and his ability to build linkages across international boundaries. But let's challenge ourselves to make sure that we're able to embrace a diversity of views, voices, and perspectives so that all are included and enjoy a sense of belonging in our communities as we seek to build God kingdoms on earth. Thank you. And I'm really happy to take questions, but also really welcome comments, feedback on anything that you've heard.
A question should be posed in chat. The first one is about saying more about community building at Kuno.
So I think what I'm going to highlight is community building. So I think how I'm interpreting this question is the work that we do in trying to lift up the voice of community perspectives at the UN. And if that is not a correct interpretation of the question, please let me know. But so I'm happy to talk about that particular focus in our work. And really, this is a challenge that we face because working at the UN is really about working with a club of governments. And governments have all sorts of formalities and restrictions on how exchange of views and ideas take place. And governments, when you hear a perspective at the UN, are talking points that are delivered by a diplomat. Those are really very formal, thought out pieces of foreign policy that are delivered from a capital to diplomats at the UN. They usually do not include the views of communities. So for instance, when we look at different post-conflict situations, we may hear the views of governments, but it's much harder to hear the views of communities who are actually affected by conflict. And so this has been something that we've worked on in another different, in a range of different conflict areas. For instance, we've done quite a bit of work with working closely with the American Friends Service Committee in Burundi, where there is a Quaker community, but also that AFSC also has a program on the ground to really hold up what the needs and perspectives and analysis are from communities or from peace building practitioners on the ground, so that those are also brought into the consideration of work at the UN, so that it's not simply a matter of hearing from those policymakers who deliver foreign policy from capital. So, but I'm not sure if that totally answers the question or if I've interpreted the question correctly. But
it's always interpretation. The other one says, may I ask your thoughts on the future of the UN after one member attacked another, Russia attacking Ukraine? I'm remembering how the League of Nations ended when one country attacked another. Italy attacked Ethiopia. This is from Belfast, Maine.
Yeah. This is a really good question, and a question that I think anybody working at the UN or with the UN is wrestling with at the moment. We have seen over the past year a really flagrant example of when one country not just attacks another, but also violates the international law and the standards that are laid out in the UN Charter. I would say that this points to a way in which the UN faces incredible constraints. The reality is that the UN and the UN Charter were drafted recognizing that there were certain countries in the world that held a disproportionate amount of power. And the reality is that there is very little that the UN is capable of doing when one of those powerful countries violates the rules violates international law. This is not just a case that is true that we've seen in the case of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I would point out that there are other powerful countries that have also violated international law, and I would point to the government of this country as also being a government which in the past has violated international law in carrying out attacks against other countries. So what has happened is not necessarily this has been seen before. And in any of these instances, there is absolutely a dilemma about how to operate. And the reality is that there's very little that the UN can do. At the same time, I would highlight that that the place where we really see the constraints in the UN are in the UN Security Council. So that is really where you see the paralysis and the deadlock between very powerful countries in the Security Council. At the same time, my own view is that there is a lot more to the UN than just the UN Security Council. For instance, there is the UN General Assembly, where all 193 member states of the UN have a voice and have a vote. And that's what we've seen in these past few months, has been instances when other parts of the UN then come forward and provide a forum where the international community can weigh in and really deliver very strong political messages. The General Assembly does not have the ability to enforce resolutions that come out, but it is a really powerful political forum. The other reality is that one of the other gifts that the UN brings, and I think that's something that is often overlooked and receives much less attention, would be the work of the UN funds and programs and agencies. And for instance, in the current crisis situation, the assistance to refugees fleeing the conflict, the incredibly important work that is taking place right now, and that is only going to need to ramp up over the coming months around food insecurity. These are all really important functions that, whether it's the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Association, UNHCR, which supports refugees, OCHA, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. These are all technical areas where the UN plays a really important role in mitigating the pain associated with these instances. So while I would absolutely agree that there's a way in which what we're seeing now in this contest between great powers leads to a situation where we worry about the ability of the UN and the utility of the UN. There are also other really important functions that other parts of the UN besides the UN Security Council are performing. And so that's where a lot of, for me, I think that's where I look to, where we can find hope and oftentimes where some really important and meaningful work emerges. Although it does tend to be, it's the kind of work that has much less attention and focus than than debates within the UN Security Council.
Thank you. From across the canal, the FSC director, Northeast Director Keith Harvey, wonders if you could talk about Rustin's life and work following the 1960s and his later years, and he thanks you for sharing this information.
I am not sure that I can tell a whole lot more, other than that I do know that what I understand from having from the amount of research that I did in preparation for this presentation, was that his work really was focused on looking at economic issues, particularly focused on poverty issues related to poor African-American communities. There was, this is where a certain amount of controversy, which I referred to, emerged around Bayard Rustin, that there was a willingness, that Bayard did embrace a willingness to work in a very pragmatic way around looking at economic programs that would build up and support poor communities. For instance, this involved working with unions. And at that point in the 1960s, there was a bit of skepticism and cynicism about the role of unions in protecting the lives of poor people, because they were also seen as being very complicit with major manufacturing and capitalist endeavors in the United States. And this certainly was a time in the United States where sort of the unity and focus of the early 1960s was challenged. I am kind of hesitant to say a whole lot more than that, and I want to acknowledge that the person that you're listening to here did not grow up in this country, and so my own ability, and I feel like I want to acknowledge that there are probably many other people on this call today who know a lot more about U.S. history and the situation, or the political trends that emerged during the late 1960s. But that's what I understand, was that there was this shift in focusing on a very pragmatic level on economic justice issues, and that while, I think looking back, we would say these were really important programs that were really focused on people who had tremendous need. At the same time, within more radical left-leaning circles, it provoked a certain amount of cynicism and backlash. So that's always an interesting issue too, right? Is why, and that's what I often wonder about, is because sometimes we see that even today, when we find, if we are involved in social movements and progressive politics, that we often hold extremely high bars for and often are incredibly fast to judge and criticize others if they don't meet, if they're not radical enough, or if they don't use the right language, things like that. And the way, it strikes me in what I have read about Bayard that really was a loss to the progressive movement on social change. But I would also say that I am guessing that there are other people on this call who would speak more knowledgeably about this than I can.
We have about 4 more questions, and the next one is from Helen Mangelsdorf in the West Falmouth meeting, and she thanks you and asks about Kuno's efforts for climate change.
Sure, work on climate change. So between the two QNOs, we structure and organize our work based on what work at the UN takes place in New York and what work takes place in Geneva. The majority of the UN's work on climate change actually takes place in Geneva and in Bonn in Germany. And so it's really been QNO Geneva that has led a really fabulous and robust program of work looking at the human impacts of climate change. And our QNO representative in Geneva, Lindsay Fielder-Cook, has done a fabulous job leading that work and representing QNO and representing Quakers in the variety of different negotiations around climate change. So that's something that I would really highlight. You can definitely find a lot more information about that on our website. And, for instance, the COP meeting that was held in Scotland last year was a wonderful example where Lindsay was directly involved inside the meeting rooms with negotiations taking place, while at the same time, a really large contingency of Quakers were involved in protests and demonstration outside the meeting room. I also would like to highlight that, from our office in New York, we are really interested, because all of our work focuses on increasing and strengthening support for peaceful solutions. One of the issues that we've been really interested in is the connection between conflict and climate change, and looking at the way that that increasingly issues of conflict and crisis emerge because of the experience of climate change. So, for instance, we did do some really in-depth work during the spring looking at the conflict situation in the Sahel in Western Africa, where climate change means that a number of different communities are being pushed onto as arid lands spread and there is less space for grazing, that different communities are pushed onto ever smaller spaces of land, which inevitably produces conflict. There's also a factor of different armed groups also supplying weapons in the area, but it means that we're seeing instances of conflict emerge that we might not have otherwise, and there's a need in thinking as we respond to conflict, that conflict is not simply about, that climate change is not simply about the temperature going up. And we've seen the impact of that in our own lives here in North America, but it really has very direct impact on and creating conflict in different parts of the world. And as that happens, we need to think about how the international community responds. So those are just a few examples, but I definitely would encourage you to look for, particularly the work in Geneva, to look at the great resources that are on the website.
I read it wrong. That was Keith Harvey's question about climate change. Helen Mangelsdorf from West Falmouth Meeting is asking about Kenyan Friends that you spoke about, and that you may know NEYM is a joint with FUM and FGC yearly meeting, and it's not easy for some FGC friends to understand why the two groups can and should be connected, or why NEYM should support FUM and FGC. And could you speak to this opportunity and challenge?
So, I mean, my understanding of FGC and FUM is that these are really important mechanisms for Quakers to connect. And actually, I mean, I guess part of it is, well, I would point to FUM, FGC, I think also FWCC. These are wonderful mechanisms that allow us to maintain networks and connections between friends and to know and appreciate and benefit from the incredible diversity amongst friends. And so I know from my own experience, I mean, I'm a Quaker who grew up in Canada, which is worship. Friends meetings in Canada, and the meeting that I grew up with is very much follows very much in a British tradition. They tend to be, at least the meeting I grew up in tends to be quite a reserved. I mean, maybe that's also the Canadian temperament, but quite a reserved meeting where you can enjoy a good amount of silence. Even for me, coming to the United States, I've come into contact with a tremendous range of ways of worship and celebration with different Quaker communities, and certainly different ways in which the Bible and focus on the teachings of Christ, really the degree to which they are more or less central in the teachings of different meetings. For me, I would say that that is a richness that I value and treasure, and I've found it in coming to the United States, where I have loved. I mean, I probably am most familiar with worship at Brooklyn Meeting, where I lived for a long time, and it was always an amazing experience to find the range of people who would engage in song, express their, their experiences of the divine in ways that were not familiar to me. So I guess that's what I would sort of wonder is what is to be, there's a tremendous amount to be gained. I don't know that there is a downside. I do know, I'm certainly aware, and I will acknowledge it, that there have been, that Quakers span a diversity of political and social views as well. And so even when we look at the international community of the global community of friends, we see a lot of diversity. I guess I would encourage, in the same way that our office at the UN focuses on the idea of internationalism and building linkages and connections, between different communities around the world, it seems to me that there is a value of connecting and learning and being open to communities in our own faith community that are different from us. And there's an exchange of views and ideas. So there are certainly ways in which we are different. So there are ways in which we have much to learn and be enriched by those, for instance, FUM Quakers in Africa. And there are ways in which we have gifts and resources that we can offer them as well. It should be an exchange back and forth. And really, I would see that FUM, FGC, FWCC are really those mechanisms that allow us to do that. So, I mean, those are the ways that I have found that they have been important in my own personal life, but this is very much my own personal perspective.
We can conclude with two more questions. And Larry Jordan from West Falmouth Meeting, also in Quaker Institute for the Future. He wonders if Kuno's quiet diplomacy found equal receptions from democratic and autocratic governments.
So maybe one of the key things there is that when we work at the UN in New York, we're working with diplomats, we're working with individuals, they're people. So while you can meet a diplomat from a country which has an autocratic, authoritarian government in place, it is always possible to find diplomats who, at a personal level, do not necessarily represent or, identify with their governments. And that is one of the things that's really the key to the kind of quiet, quiet, safe spaces. I mean, that's why we're referring to it as a safe space. We're referring to it as a space where people can come, diplomats, UN officials can come and they can be themselves and they can be there in their own personal capacity, not as a representative of their government. They don't have to be bound by their instructions from capital. And UN officials do not have to be constrained by the instructions or the official positions of their offices. They're allowed to come and just share ideas as a human being. And that's really where the importance of building relationships, building trust, and having a place that has a reputation as being a place where you can come and share your own personal perspective, and what you say at Quaker House stays at Quaker House. We have a really strong emphasis on that, and it's a sense of trust that we have to maintain, and it's a heavy responsibility that we take on when we engage in this kind of work.
Thank you. The final question isn't really a question, but it could be addressed as such from Judith Lum, who I know from Quaker Institute for the Future. She said an issue of fact that she heard Nkrumah from Nigeria in the 1950s, and that would be Kwame Nkrumah, president of Ghana, leader of African movements towards independence.
I welcome the feedback. I will go back and double check that. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that point.
Okay, unless there's more questions, I think we can thank Sarah Clark for everything that she gave to us. Very wonderful talk.
Wonderful. Thank you all, friends. It's been just fabulous to have the chance to be together this afternoon.